Perfect. So thank you so much for joining us for the second WEPs Deep Dive series. My name is Miwa Park, and I am the WEPs coordinator at Women's Empowerment Principles Global Secretariat at the UN Women. For today's webinar, we have invited a familiar guests. For those of you who participated in our G20 Gender Power Gap webinar last year, so we have invited ExecuShe again to present their findings on investors' role in pushing for gender equality. So we have also a very special guest who participate during the roundtable session from two investors. We have a representative from Calvert Research and Management, AP2, pension fund from Sweden. Then we have a web signatory, REPSOL, who has been showing good records in advancing their women's leadership to present their views. So Anna later will do more of the proper introduction of the speakers. So we will first hear from some introductory remarks from UN Women and then invite ExecuShe to present its research findings. Then we'll move on to the roundtable session with the panels, followed by the Q&A session. So please feel free to write your questions to the panelists in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen throughout the webinar. And if you'd like to communicate with other participants, please use the chat function as you're doing right now. And your questions will be answered during the Q&A session or through the chat anytime. So we will answer these questions in the back end. Lastly, I wanted to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and later be uploaded to WEPs.org website to share with the general public. So to get us started, I'd like to invite Anna Feld, the Global Head of Women's Empowerment Principle, Global Secretariat at UN Women, to deliver her opening remarks. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miwa, and welcome everyone to our webinar today, and welcome in particular to our speakers, which I will introduce a bit later on. But you probably are joining the meeting today because you know that gender inequality, coupled with other crises, ongoing crises such as climate crisis, is one of the greatest challenges of our time. And at the current pace, we are faced with a daunting prospect that the fifth Sustainable Development Goal on gender equality and women's empowerment will not be reached by 2030. So with that, we are reaching out to different stakeholders that have a tremendous role in advancing gender equality in the market and to help us make gender equality a reality by 2030. Today, we will learn from the ExecuShe's team and their research findings about gender parity, particularly at the C-suites level and beyond. We have also invited two investors to talk about their commitment and actions to advance gender equality. And today's financial markets offer a wealth of opportunities to leverage financial instruments to advance gender equality and women's empowerment in the workplace, marketplace, and community. And with the rise of sustainable finance, new pathways have been created, and more investors are actually investing with a gender lens to optimize their returns on investment and reduce the risk while contributing to reducing gender inequalities. And the 7 women's empowerment principles offer investors as well as investees a blueprint or a roadmap for advancing gender equality and women's empowerment in the workplace, marketplace, and community. So we have also invited web signatories to talk about this topic from their perspective. Many of them are using the WEPs Transparency and Accountability Framework that offers indicators to measure outputs, outcomes, and ultimate impact. Because it matters for everyone, and it matters for all type of assets, from private equity, private debt, real assets, public equity, debt, etc. So this is an area that is growing, and we are very excited to hear from our two investors, but also from the web signatory. And to kick off the conversation, we'd like to hear from the ExecuShe team, because what is really, really important is that we are tracking results. If we are not tracking and we stay with some qualitative information that investees are investing in gender equality, we are not seeing the depth of the issues, and we don't see the real progress that is being made. So data tracking is very important, and that's why we are kicking off this conversation with this presentation to see what data can actually show and why it matters so much. And beyond data, we of course also believe very much in transparency. So transparency around the results and impact, as well as the volume and quality of investment capital, is very, very important to advance gender equality and women's empowerment. So with that, I'll hand it over back to you, Miwa, to take us through the program. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you, Anna, for your wonderful opening remarks. And now I'd like to invite Katharina Hoepner and Andreas Hoepner from ExecuShe to present their findings. So Katharina is Head of Impact at ExecuShe, and Andreas Hoepner is a scientific advisor at ExecuShe. So Katharina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Miwa. So let's start with the first slide then. Yeah, female executives only control 1% of shares at America's biggest companies, sometimes even less. That's the headline of a Fortune article that covered our work. Let's see on the next slide what this 1% actually means. So the total number of women executives, call it by headcount or by representation, in top US companies is gradually increasing over time. By now, it's already 3-to-1. And by the way, you only see male and female executives here because just so far no one identified as non-binary. We monitor executives as reported individually to stakeholders, which means on company websites, annual reports, and also mandatory filings. And hence, beside the total percentage of executives, as you see here, our database comprises names and characteristics of individuals as well. By now, it's like more than 90,000 already. And let me also add that we're focusing on executives. They're the ones working full-time, right? Instead of board members who usually work part-time. So let's have a look at the next slide. When focusing now on those executives that hold shares with voting power in the company, the man to women ratio decreases to 4-to-1. Yet neither executive headcount nor shareholders headcount is really equivalent to power. So not every person's voice carries the same weight, and ownership, especially in its quantity, is a key reason for having a stronger voice. On the next slide then, you see the gender power gap. Here it is. The ratio decreased drastically to 99-to-1. You can actually barely see the woman, and I couldn't actually make her smaller, which by itself is a statement already. So although about 26% of the executives are female, left side, and still 20% of executive shareholders are female, center, when adding the share value and hence considering the real voting power they hold, men executives actually hold 99 times more power than women. Men executives own about 700 billion in share value, and women only own 7. This drastic difference comes from women executives typically being in positions such as HR, with comparatively fewer shareholdings, which then at the same time means less power. So as we see, it's not really enough to consider who's present at the executive table, but the not as visible part, like the gender power gap, really should be considered as well. On the next slide, we added an intersectional perspective. And you see that of this 99% of power controlled by male executives, 95% is held by white. And of this disappearing 1% of power controlled by female executives, still only 70% is held by, still 70% is held by whites, not only. Yeah, let me explain the methodology briefly, as I also understand that transparency is key. Some of you may know this already, yet gender power is still a relatively new measure. So let's look at the next slide and see how we measure executives' power by gender. So first of all, to know how powerful executives are, we monitor their shareholdings. Their shares give them the right to vote on corporate decision-making. For US companies, share transactions can be monitored through official SEC filings. Yet such a good disclosure doesn't really exist for other countries. Hence, outside the US, we have to estimate the gender power. And on the other side, we know the gender of the executive through our live gender data space, where we have live data updated weekly, monthly. So then, based on these two pieces of information, we can calculate the monetary weighted power of women executives proportional to all executives. Let me explain this with an example on the next slide. Next slide, please. So here, we're just going to look at 6 positions. The actual data sets consist of more than 90 positions for more than 7,000 companies. And to keep it simple, we also just focus on 3 industries. On the next slide, the actual example stats. Yes, so in technology, hardware and equipment industry on the left, the chief technology officer, it's a green part, holds 11% of the power among all these 6 executives. Hence, in tech and hardware, the CTO is pretty much as powerful as the chief financial officer, which is the blue part. Also in media and entertainment, on the very right, the CFO is still 3 times more powerful. And if you compare it with consumer services in the middle, here the CFO is 9 times more powerful than the CTO. And also the other way around, in consumer services and media and entertainment, the chief operating officer, which is the purple part, is much more powerful than in tech. So what does this mean? If a woman became CTO in consumer services, doesn't really mean very much. If a woman became CTO on technology and hardware, that would mean way more. And in the same way, a female chief operating officer in consumer services means a lot more than it would in tech. And then based on this, we have the ability to take the position power in a given industry and apply it to companies globally. On the next slide, there's an example. We're focusing on technology and hardware here. And to keep it simple, we assume that these 2 tech companies on the right side have the same split, which is why the patterns of the charts look the same way. So if in one tech company on the very right, the actual CFO was a woman and all other executives were men, we'd have a gender power gap of 7-1. If in another company, the only woman was the chief HR, we'd have a gender power gap of 24-1. So even though the headcount would be equal in these 2 examples, the power wasn't. And now returning to the 1-99 gender power gap that you saw at the beginning, women typically hold less powerful positions. Even when one and the same position is less powerful in a specific industry, it's often more likely to be held by a woman. So let's look at the last slide then. In essence, this is the same equation as in the beginning. Just instead of the actual shares, we use the estimated voting power here, which, as you saw, is based on the power which executive positions hold in companies' respective sector for US equivalents. So this estimation then enables us to close the existing data gap and shed light on the gender power gap globally. Should you want to know more, just reach out. Besides 7,000 companies, we cover almost 7,000 institutional investors as well, where we monitor the portfolios, and are always happy to provide free trial access to the database, also to prepare free trial fund screenings. Thanks a lot, and let's listen to my brother Andreas now for the latest data insights.
Thank you very much. I shall take over the screen sharing. Eva, if you stop sharing, I'll take over. So we're now taking this data, gender share and gender diversity, and we're combining it with insights on engagement by investors, asset owners and asset managers. It's going to be a sample report, a very short 2-page sample report to introduce you into the concept. But the good side is that by now, some investors have issued 10 years of stewardship reports. And quite a few of the stewardship reports in recent years provide the target companies, in some cases, thousands of target companies. So we are able to look which topics do the stewards engage on. Of course, that's not only gender, there will certainly be climate, possibly water, many other topics. And then which companies in the portfolios get engaged and which companies are in the portfolios via SEC filings, for instance, and are not engaged. And so here for the example report, just to explain the case, we'll use a French insurance. So an asset owner will use S&P 500 constituents to make it relatively comparable. And we're looking at the insurance versus peers. So at the diversity side, it's 26.2% currently in terms of gender diversity. That trails the French peers by 0.4%, European peers by 0.3%, the global peers by 0.2%. Coming to gender share, as my sister shown, that are much lower numbers, unfortunately. The average, and that's the portfolio weighted average rather than the share value weighted average, so the number is a bit higher because the tech companies don't hit that hard in terms of hundreds of billions owned by Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, Larry Page, and so forth. We're at 11.4% for the French asset owner. That trails national peers by percent, and that trails by about 0.7% global and continental peers, whereby the global are hit tiny bit better than the continental. Now, the beauty with the ability to have real impact outcomes, such as gender share or gender diversity, and to have the data on it at a much better level than we would have had it, say, 10 years ago, is we can actually look at a track record. So if we look at the track record for this particular asset owner, and we split the track record up into targeted firms and non-targeted firms, so the targeted firms are the ones that are engaged, the non-targeted ones that are not engaged, we can see here, and to be fair with the asset owner, that's very much potentially due to the pandemic, right? You see when the drop comes in is the pandemic, so that could be pandemic-induced unfortunate asset owner results. Prior to pandemic, the engagement works. There was a pandemic, it may not have worked. So of course, we can't explain yet the actual aspects, but we can see a narrowing here between the targeted and the non-targeted firms on the gender diversity. And we see a similar aspect on the gender share, where the overall numbers are going up a bit, but the targeted ones, which are in this case about 24 firms, so a reasonable number, but not super much, are not yet moving up. But the key aspect here is that that can be measured over time, quarter on quarter, months on months, week on week. We can now look at a peer. So this would be, say, a passive one to give a sense what happens with a passive, much larger exposure. And if we look at a peer, on the gender diversity, there isn't really much happening. The passive peer is pretty flat on the 25% mark. So it's a lower mark, but not really moving up very much. This passive peer is also disclosing to engage. So all of these engagement targets are disclosed. On the actual gender share, there is progress on the passive peer. And so there is some progress here moving up and going forward. And we should highlight that this particular asset owner may want to sign the WEPs, because when we look at gender engagement initiative, it's not yet a WEP signatory, although of course several of the peers are. In this case, it's only 30% club and diversity project. WEPs is particularly big in France, so it's something that could be focused on. And the point that we're trying to make here is that this kind of engagement track records, we'll just take one particular asset owner here as an example, can now be tracked over 3 or 5 year track records. And that means that track records, not only in financial return, but hopefully also in gender and then gender return, so enhancements in gender diversity and hopefully in particular gender share will become more common. That is paramount to reach the SDG 5 by 2030. At that stage, thank you very much for listening to our research, and I will hand back to the panel.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andreas and Katharina, for this insightful research. And now we'd like to move on to hear from actual investors and web signatories. So I'll hand the floor over to Anna. And before doing that, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function to send in your questions so we can get those answered. So Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Miwa, and welcome very much to our panelists today. We have the great pleasure of having John Streur, CEO of Calvert Research and Management, Eva Halvarsson, CEO of AP2, which is a pension fund in Sweden, and Maria Pilar Rojas, who is a leader on corporate culture, diversity and inclusion, and employer value proposition at REPSOL. So welcome, the three of you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. As I mentioned earlier, we'd really like to hear the points of views of the investors, but then once we heard from the investors, to also hear from Maria Pilar Rojas and from the perspective of a WEP signatory. As Miwa was just mentioning, there will be a Q&A session afterwards. So keep your questions and put them in the Q&A chat so that both for the research part and for this panel part. So I would like to start and just asking John, how do these research findings that we just heard from ExecuShe resonate with Calvert as an investor?
Great. Thank you very much, Anna. And I'm thrilled to be here. And by the way, my colleague, Jade Huang, will be joining me in the Q&A session. Miwa, we prepared a few slides to answer these questions. I'm not sure if we can share those or not, but if so, this would be great. Andreas and Katharina made a number of points regarding the women in the workplace. And what they showed us was that so many companies lack female participation at the senior management level and have failed to provide women with the power necessary for them to have meaningful impact at companies. At Calvert, our mission is to drive positive change in ways that we think will create better outcomes for women and underrepresented groups worldwide, and also drive financial returns for our clients who are long-term investors. In order to do that, we undertake engagement with companies to help them improve themselves, really. And we think that if companies could significantly improve the gender equity throughout their organizations, results would improve. But we have to demonstrate the business case to the companies that we're engaged with. We have to make it clear to the senior management team why it's a good idea to improve the workplace so it will be a better environment for women and, frankly, for all underrepresented groups. So to do that, we make some key points that I'm going to share with you here today. The first slide, the top part of the slide here, shows the participation in the workforce by women over the past 70 years or so. And you can see that in 1948, only about 1/3 of the US workforce was made up of by women, and the majority of the workforce was male. However, over the ensuing period, that has changed significantly. So many more women have come into the workforce that today, men and women are approximately equally represented in the US workforce. By the way, we should all thank women for coming into the workforce, because across the developed world, this has added significantly to GDP in our economy. So we're all better off for the economic activity created by having women in the workforce. However, if we look on the next slide, if we could go, there we go. One of the things that is also very important to recognize is that women have achieved higher educational attainment over this period. And you can see, going back to the 1940s on the upper chart, that at the beginning of this period, many more men were getting advanced degrees than women. However, if you look all the way over on the right-hand side, in 2020, more women than men achieved advanced degrees. These are bachelor's, master's, and PhDs. And this is really the case worldwide. So in addition to having a greater percentage of the workforce made up by women, the skilled workforce today and the skilled workforce of the future is increasingly female. This is extremely important because obviously we've become a knowledge society. And so much of the corporate profitability is driven by intellectual capital and intellectual property. And that, of course, depends on advanced education. And so I think these two trends, increased participation in the workforce and increased educational attainment by women, create a condition where companies really need to have a great workplace and provide equity and good conditions for women. If we can go to the next slide, I think we've got one more. This also shows that over this period of time, the companies in industries, in sectors that depend on intellectual property, intellectual capital, have really grown quite a bit. And you can see that the financial services and professional and business services, education and healthcare, information and technology, these are the sectors that have really grown significantly, much more rapidly than the sectors that depend on raw materials or simple capital. So the sectors that depend on advanced education have been where the growth is in the economy. And we really understand how important it is that companies are able to attract these highly skilled women. I think we may have one more slide, or that might be it. Not sure how many we put in. So we bring this information to companies and we engage with them. We ask companies for three major things. And I want to go back to a comment that was made at the beginning by Anna. Transparency is so important. We need the information about the demographics of the company. Who has what job at the company? Are women moving up the executive ranks? So we ask them for transparency so we can see how they're doing. Second, we ask companies to develop principles and policies and internal guidelines so that they will create a strong and equal workplace so women can make their full contribution. And then finally, we ask companies to add more women to the board and specifically to add more women to the executive ranks. We do that very directly. It's reflected in our proxy voting. And I'll just close with a quick comment. Today, we expect companies' boards to be at parity. So we have gone from asking companies to add 2 or 3 women or to get to 30% women on the board. Today, we ask companies for parity, someplace between 40 and 60% women, someplace between 40 and 60% men. That's important. And of course, we want a similar balance in senior management. And by the way, we also ask companies for ethnic minorities on the board that are consistent with the country of domicile. So we're not asking for 1 or 2 ethnic minorities. We're asking for similar representation based on the population of the country that they're headquartered in. So thank you very much. These are the points that we make to our investee companies as we seek to drive the positive change needed to improve the workplace for women. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. And I think it's important to emphasize that it's not about putting 1 or 2 women on the board, but seeking parity, and not only parity on the board, but also, as we saw from the research from ExecuShe, that it needs to also trickle down, and your data about employment basically shows that there are no longer any excuses for not having parity in the company, in the leadership team, and on the board. So thank you very much for that. Eva, why do you care? Why does AP2 care about gender equality and as an investor?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This really is a question close to my heart. The short answer is that we think that companies that focus on these issues are better investments. I could stay there, but I can give you some background to that. And the reason for our thinking is we have a belief that if you have greater diversity in background and experience, the teams in the companies can become more innovative and creative. And this in turn will help developing more successful companies. And actually the first initiative on sustainability that AP2 took 20 years ago, that was around diversity, and it was to produce an index on female representation in Sweden in certain educations, management positions, and board seats from a background very similar to what John spoke about recently. And we have now done that for over 20 years, and the next publication will be due sometime in early June this year. And the reason that we took this initiative was that we wanted to provide the discussion in the society with on diversity with facts as a way to drive change. And when we started doing this in 2003, there were 11% women in executive positions in listed companies in Sweden. This is a small, this is only in Sweden, and there were 6% in the boards of these companies. And now there are 27% women in the executive teams, and there are 35% in the boards. And coming back to our study, thinking of what John spoke about when it comes to education and university education, that we also have seen during the years that the best students at those educations that we are looking for in economics, in technical education, the best students actually are women. So we are very keen that we will see them in company executive positions and in boards. And one more thing is that during the years we've been looking at these facts and these figures, we have also seen a positive correlation between the nomination committees. That is something we have, at least here in Sweden and some parts of the world, to nominate board members. When there are women in the nomination committees, we also see boards with a higher proportion of women. So that's a few words from us on why we care about this. It's absolutely necessary for us to be a good investor to focus on these.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this data that you were talking about, taking from 6 to 27%, I think it's really, really key to see that small steps, but progress
Yes.
is happening. So, so when you make investment decisions, how do you more concretely take gender equality into account? Now you have the commitment, and the AP2 understands the importance, but give some insights on how you go about it.
Yeah, there are different ways to do this, and that's according to the way that we invest. We are a global investors investing over 40 billion US dollars. We have that in assets all over the world and in almost all asset classes. So from that perspective, I would say that we have 3 different investment styles, and that affects how we integrate issues on diversity. And those styles are, we are investing with a quantitative model, and we are investing with a fundamental style, and then we are investing directly in private assets like private equity and real estate. And just a few words on when investing with a quantitative model, we have been constructing our own indices. And that is something you do to decide on what companies to invest in from a number of different factors that we think are important for driving the return. And some of these factors are related to sustainability, and within those, some of them focus on diversity. Just one small example is the proportion of women in the company, because in our research on testing the best factors, we have seen that from a global perspective and over the years, companies with a larger proportion of women has over time contributed to better return. So we're not doing this from some kind of political perspective, but from a pure return perspective. And going further to our fundamental investing, and that is when we invest in fewer companies with a very close relationship to them. We constantly have dialogues with them on these issues and others. And we also take part in nomination committees to appoint the board where those exists, and we also use our voice at the annual general meetings, and we always vote no to boards where there is only one gender in them. And thirdly, in our investments in private assets, like private equity, this is something that's very prominent in our due diligence process. And in that, we try to evaluate the status of the issues internally around diversity, and also we are looking at policies and guidelines and see how they are implemented, if they are not just lying in the shelf, but really being implemented, and also have a discussion with potential general partners what the company's goals are within this area. So different ways to invest, different ways to integrate diversity.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eva. I think that also gives our participants a great view on what they need to do from their side to attract your investment. We are running very short on time, actually. So, John, we have another question for you before we turn to Pilar. So, if you were to look at the data that is available for you as an investor, what data is missing at the moment, and what could companies do better to basically produce more data that can help you as investors?
Thank you very much, and I'll be brief. I think there are two types of data that are very, very important. One is an extension of some of the information that ExecuShe put on regarding economics. They focused on the equity ownership. We really want to see information about gender equity in pay throughout the organization. I think that's clearly needed. I think that will be helpful to organizations to focus on that and to share that information transparently. Second, we want the complete demographics of the organization. Who has what job at what level by race and ethnicity. In the United States, every company with more than 100 employees needs to file a report with the EEOC that gives out that information. We want that information to be made transparent. We want all investors to be able to see throughout the organization the gender and the race at every level. That, combined with the pay information, is what we need. We have a lot of information about policies, procedures, goals, etc., but we need the details regarding what is happening inside the company. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there are already questions coming for the Q&A session. So let's move over to Pilar as a web signatory that has been doing quite well on some of these issues. How are you as a company responding to the increased attention by investors to gender equality? And what concretely have you done to respond to this trend?
Yes, thank you very much, Anna, for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to join this session today with the panelists. Well, I believe that gender diversity, as we have seen with the trends, is advancing, and we will reach equality in all positions, also in executive positions eventually. But I think we all can agree that the pace is too slow, and that we must ask ourselves what we can do differently to accelerate these trends. And in this regard, I think it's crucial that investors are requesting data from companies about diversity. And because I believe it has the power to drive progress by demanding this vital information. And I wonder if there is maybe this is a reflection for John and Eva, if in the future we will see more data requests about inclusion, not only representation of women in different levels, but also data regarding the perception of women within the company, how they feel they can have equal opportunities and that they can develop their full potential regardless of gender within the company. Not only they are in the company, but also they can share the talent and grow within the organization, because I believe that perceptions are also important. Our response to investors that request this information extends beyond compliance and trying to demonstrate our commitment to fostering a diverse and inclusive workshop. workplace. And there is extensive information about diversity and inclusion, also gender pay gap in our integrated management report and in our webpage, in this transparency that John mentioned earlier. Another example is, for example, REPSOL ESG Day. It is an event organized by REPSOL every year to raise awareness and highlight our commitment to sustainability and responsible business. The purpose of this day is to provide stakeholders and investors and the public with an overview of our environmental initiatives, our social responsibility efforts, etc. And just last year, REPSOL commitment to diversity and inclusion was shared with investors as an integral to our overall ESG strategy and aligned with our broader sustainability goals. So it is very much linked. We believe that it's a win-win that investors are requesting this information because it's a priority of our company for many years. To this point, we have 39% of our workforce are women, which is very good data for a company in our sector and our activities.
Great. So going forward, what are your plans to improve gender equality in your company?
Well, REPSOL has implemented a wide range of initiatives to promote gender balance and ensure this equal opportunity. We are focused on several priorities like parity in recruiting through the implementation of gender neutral recruitment policies, increasing the representation of women in leadership positions through targeted development programs and mentoring opportunities as well. And another focus area is awareness within the company towards the benefits of diversity and inclusion, and very specifically support our leaders since they have the power to shape the culture and values.
Very good.
I'm sorry, COVID has got me.
So I just want to make sure, did you want to add something or you took a break?
No, I think that that's the overall view. We regularly report on our progress and key performance indicator. We measure percentage of women joining the company, the participation of women in the key development activities that we do. We analyze the results of our key talent management process, like performance, compensation, promotion, etc. So we keep track of everything that's important in order to identify issues and deal with them to ensure that we provide equal opportunities within our company. So we are focusing not only on diversity, that is representation, which is key, but also how employees feel regarding inclusion, employees from different dimensions of diversity, also by frequent surveys and measuring employee experience.
Great. No, thank you so much. And I think that it's something for us to think more about, the inclusion and the belonging part, because that also contributes to retention rates. So you don't want to only attract talent, female talent into the company, but you want to keep them as well. And that's where those measures are coming into play. So great. I think we have now about 14 minutes for a Q&A. I see that questions have already come in from participants. I saw the first one. It might be useful to elaborate for the ExecuShe team a little bit more about the source of the data. There was a questions whether there was US data and how you are using the data. So maybe just some clarification around that. There was a question about if somebody, but I think John, you also brought it up with gender pay gap, but if others want to elaborate a little bit more on the importance of gender, the equal pay, and any tips and on engaging on a company's gender pay gap. we also had a question, how do you manage equality, gender equality, when staffing projects in countries where men are predominantly the providers of households? The struggle is that we find less women are part of the workforce in some countries. And then we had another question about equal pay and equal opportunities certification. I think if that is important, so to have certified equal pay, and if that would help the situation as well. And the final question that we have so far is, companies often struggle internally to share detailed data about employee representation, diversity and inclusion, unless part of a mandatory policy requirement. In certain countries, requiring employees to disclose gender and ethnicity information is not legal. How are other WEPs and other organizations pushing for policies to mandate data sharing? So I think these are the main questions at this point. There's a lot of difference. So I think we'll just take a round, everybody respond from their perspective, but let's start with the ExecuShe team on the data, source of data that you are using in your research and the findings that you presented to us.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I just start here. So we have an external perspective. We do not get the data from the companies, but as I said in the presentation, we take it from company websites and reports and, like, for example, SEC filings. And this is where we really get the executive teams with the gender. And then if there is a lack of data, and like private companies may not have any mandatory disclosing, so there would be little data. This is also information, right? Like, you could imagine it as a transparency rate. Some companies disclose 40 executives, others just 1. And this also gives you information. This is why we have the positions, so you could compare. And then if we come to the gender power gap, we have this data for US, it's form 3, 4, and 5. That's also in the presentation. And as this is not data that we have globally, this is where we close the data gap by estimating in the way I explained before in the presentation, like taking the position power by industry and then move it around the world. Not sure, Andreas, if you want to add something.
To add, so a similar estimation could be undertaken on gender pay gap, which is required to be disclosed in the UK based on factors. There was another question, which I might have just already answered before, on if women invest differently as a block. We find in a recent paper, women are indeed more likely to conduct impact investments. I answered it under the... Oh, sorry. All the additional data coming up. I don't know how much you could hear. I suddenly hit an unmute button. All the additional data coming up will be very useful. Did you hear what I said before, Anna? Just checking.
No, you cut off a little bit, but there was just, I think you realized it and recapped.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Then let's go to John.
Thank you. There are some questions that came in that I'd like to just take a chance to address, and also connect it to what was said earlier about inclusivity. And some of the questions that have come in are in regards to women having to potentially leave the company, leave the workplace to have kids, or for other biological or health related reasons. I think this is a very important point, that companies need to have appropriate policies to create an equal playing field for men and women, recognizing the facts that biologically women have children and women have health-related needs that may require them to leave the workplace episodically. Some advanced companies have created leave requirements for men also, so that men will also periodically leave the workplace, to create more parity between how the company deals with men and women. So this is really a management practice issue. And we would like companies to recognize the importance of women in the workforce and to create management policies so that women can be completely included in management. Women can come in and out of the company as they need to attend to other issues, and that the company's policies are equally applied to men and women. So those are pretty big requests that we make of companies, but we think that that's what it's going to take to create this much more inclusive system so that women can make their full contribution to the company. Thank you.
If I could just add, I'm also from Calvert, so thank you for this opportunity. Just to tag on to what John said, in the diversity focused strategies that we run, kind of trying to get to that inclusive culture is really, in addition to kind of, understanding the number of women on the board or minorities, is really the crux of what we're trying to understand. So all of this disclosure, whether it's mandated through, regulatory environment, is really important to investors to be able to benchmark and be able to understand, is the company offering an environment in which, the strengths of diversity can really flourish, and there's opportunities to really drive innovation and everything that Eva kind of talked about. And so this inclusivity part is really kind of at the crux of what we're trying to get a sense of.
Great, thank you so much, Jade. We have some additional questions that I'm just adding in for our panel. How to address the fact that most companies have very limited data on gender equality. How do we address that? Another question is, are there any trends around women as a block of investors? Do they invest differently from men? And are they investing more in women-led, women-owned companies? So we'll continue the responses. So over to you, Eva.
Thank you. Maybe a few responses and one comment. I was really glad when Maria spoke about the diversity, equity, and inclusion. I had thought to mention this because this is really something for us also, that we decided to move on from diversity to include equity and inclusion. And my strong belief is that if you are to be a good investor, you need to start at home. So to be able to live as you learn, to drive change in the companies you invest in, you need to include these issues at home. So we have been putting forward a DEI policy. We have had over the years certain deep, what we call dilemma discussions with our team. We are a small organization, only 70 people, so we can have discussions around what is inclusion, how do you feel included. We have measured this also in our employee satisfaction, etc. So for us to be able to go out and talk to the companies that we invest in, we need to be sure, we need to really understand these issues from a home perspective. But these are difficult in one way to measure, maybe. And I thought just a few more comments on, there was some question on developing countries, how we can deal with the issue that men are supposed to earn the money for their families, etc. And we have been investing together with the World Bank to promote women entrepreneurs in certain developing countries to drive their own businesses, and that has been a very successful story to make it easier for them to lend money with the bank to do their business. And also another question to end with about small companies, like small private investments. How do you drive these issues? Well, you have to be persistent. When I raised these issues on diversity with the guys in Palo Alto and Silicon Valley 15 years ago, they looked at me like I was something that the dog dragged in. They didn't like these issues at all. They thought they were irrelevant, but we have been really persistent and said that why should we want to continue to invest if all the people in the company, they are white, male, been trained at the same schools, been working with McKinsey or Bain? Why would we believe that they are the ones that think differently? So we keep nagging them, and we see some change, but so slowly.
Thank you so much, Eva, and thanks for being so persistent. It helps us as well. We get many companies that come and sign on to the Women's Empowerment Principles exactly for your persistence. They said, oh, our investor said that we need to focus on gender equality. We want to make a commitment and start the journey. So thank you so much to all the investors that might also have joined the call for being so persistent, because you do have the power to make a difference. So we have Pilar. You might have some reflections also based on what the other panelists were responding.
Yes, very interesting comments regarding gender pay gap. Well, I believe that there are certain things that companies should do in that regard. For example, every year after our compensation process, we audit that process extensively. People analytics tell a story, and sometimes it's a story of inclusion and sometimes not. So analyze and keep analyzing to try to uncover issues that are deep within the company regarding all the talent management process, but also regarding pay gap, has led us to have a gender difference of under 6% nowadays. Our main differences are not related to, well, are related to the different nature of jobs and different levels where women and men are within the company, not so much as same type of positions. But my recommendation would be to analyze a lot, audit the processes, and review how women and men are comparing in all the key talent management processes that the company has. And do a lot of internal awareness. Within societies, it can be clearer, but within the company, we need to insist that gender diversity is not a zero-sum equation. Because it is not involve a trade-off where one gender's progress comes at the expense of another, right? It's about recognizing and embracing the value that both men and women bring to the table, to the company, and keep doing that within the company to create that inclusive culture that it's required, so that all the key talent management processes are done in the proper way.
Very good, thank you. That was very timely. We are actually a little bit a minute over time, but if everyone could be patient in staying on, we have a poll question that we'd like to launch right now to understand your interest in the topic and how useful it was, and if you have joined other WEPs event before, and would you be willing to participate in future WEPs event? But with that, while we are running the poll, just to summarize very briefly and thank our panelists so much for their insights and perspectives. I think what we learned today is really that we need more women everywhere, but not only to just place them in the companies and start counting them, but also make sure that they feel inclusive, that they belong in the company, and that also helps to retain them and save on the investment costs that it costs actually to bring in new talent into the company. But we also learned that investors also need to pay attention to this agenda, both internally, and in their investment decisions, and that we need women in those investment committees to make sure that the investments, and I think there was a question and somebody also shared some additional information about how women are backing investment in women-owned businesses. So if we really want to own this, we need to increase the number of women. But we know that still, I think there's only about 6% of the world's companies are run by women CEOs. We also need to have the men on board. And we heard from John, we heard from Andreas, how committed they are and how they are helping to drive this agenda, and that we need men involved too, to help us make progress, because it's not only about positioning women in companies, but it's also about making sure that once they are in the companies, there are gender equality policies, practices, the culture is nurturing, and the culture makes people want to stay in the company and continue to grow and become leaders. So with that, we are host and panelists cannot vote, but maybe we have some results that we can show Miwa. And with that, I think we will close for today and thank the panelists very, very much for your time, for your insight, and for your perspectives on gender equality from investment perspective, from research perspective, and from the operational aspect of a company and how you take gender equality to make it a reality. And with that, I really hope that we will actually achieve SDG 5 by 2030. So help being persistent and push forward. And thank you so much for your support to this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.